I never thought I would be sharing this story, but it's something I can't keep inside anymore. For too long, I lived in silence, convincing myself that things would get better, that somehow the storm in my life would pass. But it didn't. My husband, the man I once trusted with my heart, became someone I barely recognized. The arguments turned to control, the control to threats, and eventually I found myself trapped in a cycle I couldn't break on my own. One night, after another incident that left me shaking and terrified, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. That was the moment I knew. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't let fear dictate my life. I needed help. With trembling hands and a heart pounding so loud it drowned out my thoughts, I gathered the courage to walk into the police station. In my hands was a piece of paper, a small shield of hope against the overwhelming weight of my situation. As I crossed the threshold, I told myself, this is the right thing. This is the first step toward freedom. But the moment I stepped in, I felt the walls closing in. Every eye in the room seemed to pierce through me, and the knot in my stomach tightened. Still, I forced myself to approach the counter, clutching that paper like it was my lifeline. My voice barely a whisper, I said, "I need to report my husband." The officer barely looked at me. His indifference was like a slap in the face, but I pushed on, thinking it was just a formality. Little did I know, this moment, this one moment where I dared to seek help, would shatter me in ways I never imagined. What followed wasn't safety, wasn't understanding, wasn't the help I so desperately needed. Instead, it was something far worse. I'll never forget the way his gaze shifted, the tone of his voice, the way every word he spoke chipped away at the fragile courage I had managed to piece together. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, my escape. Instead, it became another chapter of pain I wasn't prepared to endure. But I'll tell you what happened next, because this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been silenced when they needed to be heard. It wasn't easy to make that decision. For months, I lived with a constant battle inside my mind. I told myself it would get better, that I could endure it, that maybe, just maybe, it was somehow my fault. But deep down, in the quiet moments when everything around me went silent, I knew the truth. This wasn't going to get better. This wasn't something I could just endure. The fear was suffocating, eating away at me piece by piece. Every night I would lie in bed replaying the words, the threats, the anger, his voice echoing in my head, telling me I was nothing, that no one would believe me if I ever tried to speak up. And for a long time, I believed him. It's strange how easy it is to start doubting yourself when you hear those words enough times. But there was another voice in me, quiet, almost drowned out by the fear, telling me that I deserved more. That voice kept me alive. One night, after another argument turned to shouting and the shouting turned to something worse, I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes hollow. I didn't even recognize the person staring back. That was the moment I knew something had to change. If I didn't do something, I was going to lose myself entirely. The decision didn't come easily. It wasn't a moment of sudden bravery. It was the result of countless nights crying silently into my pillow, hiding bruises, both physical and emotional, from the world. I rehearsed what I would say over and over in my head. I wrote it down, crossed it out, and wrote it again. Even on the day I decided to go to the police station, my legs felt like they were made of lead. My heart raced so fast I thought I might pass out. But I told myself, "You can do this. You have to do this." As I walked into the station, the world around me felt like a blur. People were coming and going, talking, laughing, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. I clutched the piece of paper in my hand. the words I had written trembling slightly as if they carried the weight of my entire life. "I need to report my husband," I whispered, my voice barely audible. It was a phrase I had repeated to myself countless times, but saying it out loud in front of someone made it real in a way that shook me to my core. I thought I would feel relief. Instead, I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the walls of the station were closing in around me. The officer barely looked up from his desk. His indifference was like a slap in the face. "Hurt you? How?" he asked, his tone cold, almost dismissive. For a moment I froze. I had expected questions, maybe even skepticism, but not like this, not so casual, as though my pain was an inconvenience. I forced myself to speak, to explain. My words came out haltingly, my voice trembling as I recounted what had happened. But with every sentence, his expression remained the same, detached, uninterested. "Are you sure it wasn't your fault?" he asked finally, his words hitting me like a physical blow. I stared at him, my mind reeling. How could he ask that? Didn't he understand what it had taken for me to be there, to say those words out loud? Every ounce of courage I had managed to summon felt like it was being ripped away. But I didn't let myself cry. Not there, not in front of him. I swallowed my pain and repeated the words I had rehearsed so many times. "I need to report my husband. He's been hurting me." I said it again and again, hoping that somehow it would be enough to make him see me, to see the person standing in front of him, desperate for help. It wasn't. He sighed heavily, as though I had inconvenienced him, and scribbled something down on a piece of paper. His questions became sharper, more invasive, cutting into me like knives. I felt the strength I had built crumble piece by piece. I wanted to leave, to run out of that station and never look back, but I forced myself to stay. Because even though he didn't see me, didn't hear me, I had come too far to walk away. I didn't know it then, but that decision, to stay, to keep speaking even when it felt like no one was listening, would change everything. I stood there, my voice trembling as I tried to explain. I told him about the abuse, the nights I cried myself to sleep, the bruises I tried to hide, the constant fear that made me feel like a prisoner in my own home. I recounted the threats that hung over me like a shadow, suffocating every part of my life. I thought he would listen, I thought he would understand. But instead of the sympathy I so desperately needed, his questions became sharper, more dismissive. "Are you sure it wasn't your fault?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, staring at me like I was wasting his time. For a moment I froze. His words felt like a slap, cutting through the courage I had spent so long building. Fault? How could he even suggest that? I was here seeking help, not judgment. The room felt colder. My voice wavered as I tried to answer, to explain again that I wasn't to blame. But he wasn't listening. His eyes didn't meet mine. His tone grew colder. Then his questions shifted. They weren't just dismissive anymore. They became invasive, inappropriate, prying into details no one should ever have to share. "What were you wearing?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My heart pounded in my chest, each question making me feel smaller, more exposed. My hands were shaking, clutching the strap of my bag as though it was the only thing keeping me upright. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but fear held me in place. I thought, if I leave now, what does that mean? Will anyone else believe me? But it didn't stop. His tone grew more aggressive. His words were laced with contempt. "You're sure you didn't provoke him? You're sure you're not exaggerating?" My throat felt tight. I could barely breathe, let alone answer. This was supposed to be a place of safety, but instead I was standing in front of a man who made me feel as powerless and vulnerable as the person I was trying to escape from. I tried to take a step back, to leave, but he blocked my path. His presence was towering, menacing. The look in his eyes wasn't just dismissive now, it was predatory. I whispered, "I just want to leave." My voice cracked. I could barely get the words out, but he didn't move. He stood there as if daring me to challenge him. My heart raced. I felt trapped. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I was paralyzed by fear. He put his hand on my chest. Then he started kissing me. I felt something wrong, but he did not stop. He was standing on my backside, and he put his something in me. After some time, he put in my mouth. In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. The place I had come to for protection, for justice, had become another source of danger. The very person who was supposed to help me was now making me feel more unsafe than I had felt in my own home. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Every breath felt heavier, every thought clouded by panic. I couldn't fight him, I couldn't reason with him. All I could do was try to survive this moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stepped aside. I don't remember how I made it out of that station. My legs carried me on autopilot, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. When I reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, shaking uncontrollably. Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't stop them. I felt humiliated, violated, and completely powerless. I had taken the hardest step by walking into that station. I had found the courage to speak up. But instead of finding safety, I had walked into another nightmare. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me, suffocating me. I thought of every other woman who might walk into that station, hoping for help, only to be met with the same treatment. The thought made me sick. In that moment, sitting in my car, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't the end of my story. This couldn't be how it ended. I didn't know how or when, but I knew one thing for certain. I would make sure no one else ever had to feel this way again. No one deserved to be silenced, to be dismissed, to be made to feel like their pain didn't matter. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every woman, every person who had ever been made to feel powerless in a system that was supposed to protect them. And I wouldn't stop until that changed. When I finally stumbled out of the station, my legs barely carried me to my car. I collapsed into the seat, my hands trembling so much that I could barely grip the steering wheel. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't hold back the flood of tears. I had thought the hardest part was walking in there, but I had no idea just how broken I'd feel after walking out. I picked up my phone and dialed the only person I could think of. My voice was barely audible, cracked with the weight of what I had just endured. "He didn't help me," I whispered. He did things. I don't know what to do." On the other end, my friend's voice was steady, a rock against the chaos swirling in my mind. "You can't let this go," she said firmly. "This isn't just about you. It's about every woman who's been in your shoes. If you don't stand up now, who will?" Her words ignited something in me. She was right. As much as I wanted to retreat into silence, to disappear and pretend this had never happened, I knew I couldn't. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who had ever walked into a station like that, carrying their pain and vulnerability, only to be met with apathy or worse. I wiped my tears and began searching for the next steps. It wasn't easy. I had to relive the experience again and again as I recounted it to higher authorities, as I wrote my complaint, as I spoke to advocacy groups. Each time I felt the same tremor of fear, the same doubt creeping in. What if they don't believe me? What if it doesn't change anything? But every time I pushed forward, because now it wasn't just my voice, it was the voice of everyone who had been silenced. When I finally filed the complaint against that officer, I didn't feel immediate relief. I felt exposed, vulnerable, I knew there would be backlash, and there was, but I also knew I couldn't let fear win again. That's when others began to step forward. Advocacy groups reached out, offering support and resources. They told me my story mattered, that it was a part of a larger fight for accountability and justice. The media picked up on what had happened, and for the first time I felt like I wasn't alone in this battle. But the journey wasn't smooth. Each interview with journalists, each meeting with legal teams, felt like I was opening a wound that refused to heal. People would ask, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" Or, "Are you sure it happened the way you're saying?" Every doubt cast by strangers was a dagger to my resolve, but I kept going because I knew the fight wasn't just for me. Every time someone questioned my truth, I thought about the countless women who didn't have the strength to fight back, who had been silenced by fear or shame. Soon my story gained traction. Social media posts began circulating, and people from all over the country started sharing their own experiences. Some of their messages were heartbreaking. Women who had been through similar betrayals but never found the courage to speak up. Others were messages of solidarity and encouragement, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this fight. It became clear to me that the problem wasn't isolated to one officer or one station. It was a systemic issue, a culture of neglect and dismissal embedded within institutions meant to protect. Policies at the station were questioned, protocols were scrutinized, advocacy groups demanded reforms. But the process was slow, agonizingly slow, and often felt like shouting into a void. One day, I was invited to speak at a panel discussion about survivors of institutional betrayal. I hesitated at first. What if I froze? What if people didn't believe me? But then I thought about that moment in the station, the look in the officer's eyes, the way he dismissed my pain. I couldn't let that be the end of my story. Standing on that stage, I shared my truth. I spoke about the fear, the humiliation, and the overwhelming sense of powerlessness I felt. But I also spoke about resilience, about finding strength in the darkest moments, about refusing to let the system silence me. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. For the first time in a long time, I felt heard, truly heard. The aftermath of sharing my story publicly wasn't without its challenges. There were threats, people who tried to discredit me, and days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But there were also victories, small ones at first, like an apology from a higher-ranking officer, and bigger ones later, like the implementation of sensitivity training for staff at the station. This isn't just my fight. It's for everyone who's ever been silenced, dismissed, or betrayed when they needed help the most. It's for every woman who walked into a station seeking justice and walked out carrying more scars. It's for the voices that were ignored, for the stories that were never told. In sharing my story, I hope to ignite a spark in others, because silence isn't an option, fear isn't an option. Change only happens when we demand it, when we refuse to accept anything less than accountability and justice. If you faced something like this, know that you're not alone. Speak out, seek support, and never stop fighting for justice. Share this story, talk about it, demand better from the systems that are supposed to protect us. Because no one should ever feel unsafe when asking for help. Safety isn't a privilege, it's a right. And together we can make sure no one has to fight this battle alone.